There's something deeply moving about the bond between a family and their pets. It's the kind of connection that feels unbreakable, a silent promise of loyalty and love that transcends everything. But imagine if that bond led you not just through everyday life, but all the way to your new home, a place you never would have discovered if it weren't for your dog. It sounds unbelievable, doesn't it? A lost dog, wandering through unfamiliar streets, on a journey of its own. But this isn't just any lost dog. This is the beginning of a story that will leave you speechless, a tale of perseverance, heartache, and ultimately, finding something greater than what you were looking for. It's a reminder that sometimes, life's most important moments don't arrive when we expect them, but through the smallest of steps, like a dog's paw prints leading the way. It all started on a quiet morning when a family's dog went missing. The little creature had slipped away unnoticed, and despite all efforts to find it, nothing seemed to work. The family posted flyers, checked shelters, and asked around the neighborhood, but there was no sign. Days passed, each one heavier than the last, the worry weighing down on everyone. But the story takes a turn when they get a call that would set them on a path they never imagined. The dog had been spotted miles away. Not just anywhere, but in a small town they'd never even considered. What followed was an adventure that would change the course of their lives forever. As the family set out to find their beloved pet, little did they know that the journey would reveal something far more profound than they had anticipated. The path was no longer just about finding a dog, it was about finding answers to questions they didn't even know they were asking. Why was their dog drawn to that particular place? What was it about this town that felt so right, so familiar, as if they were meant to be there? As they traveled through winding roads and unfamiliar landscapes, the tension built, every moment uncertain, every turn raising more questions than answers. What did fate have in store for them? And then, just when they thought they were getting closer, something happened. Something that made them pause, something that shifted the course of the journey. Was it the dog they were really searching for? Or was there something more waiting for them, something that would make them question everything they thought they knew about home, about destiny, and about the connection between them all? This is where the story truly begins, a story that proves sometimes the answers we seek aren't just found in the places we expect, but in the unexpected paths that lead us there. Stick with us to discover where this journey leads, and what the family will find in the end. The drive to the small town was long, and every passing mile seemed to stretch out the uncertainty. The family, still reeling from the shock of the call, was left to process the impossible situation. The dog, who had always been there, always part of their daily routines, was now leading them down a path they never expected. It was almost as if the dog was the guide, pulling them towards something, but what? They couldn't shake the feeling that they were chasing more than just a lost pet. As the car cruised through unfamiliar stretches of countryside, the family members glanced at each other, unsure of what to say. Conversations about the dog's disappearance had slowly quieted, replaced by nervous silence. What did they really know about this town? The name was unfamiliar, the streets strange and unwelcoming. The only thing they had to go on was a few vague details from the call and the hope that the dog was still somewhere out there, waiting for them. The town itself felt off. There was an air of mystery to it, like it was holding its breath. The streets were quiet, the houses almost too still, as though the entire place had been frozen in time. It wasn't a bustling place, but rather one that seemed to live in its own quiet rhythm, disconnected from the rest of the world. They checked into a small inn on the outskirts, trying to gather information. The owner, an elderly woman, seemed oddly calm as she welcomed them, her eyes holding something behind them, a knowledge that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. When they asked about the dog, her face shifted slightly, but her words remained simple and vague. Dogs have a way of finding their way home. They follow what's familiar, even when they don't know it themselves. Her smile was tight, almost too knowing, and it made them uneasy. Was this just the ramblings of an old woman, or did she know more than she was letting on? As they settled into their rooms, the mystery deepened. The dog had been spotted near a grove of trees at the edge of town, but there was nothing else to guide them. With no specific location to go on, they decided to venture out on foot, retracing the path the dog had supposedly taken. The town seemed to watch them as they walked, the silence pressing in on them. The buildings, old and weathered, had an abandoned quality, as though many had stood empty for years. It was as if they were trespassing in a place that didn't want to be found. Every corner they turned, every shadow that crossed their path, only made them feel more like strangers in a land they were never meant to know. It wasn't long before they found themselves standing at the edge of the grove the woman had mentioned. The trees were thick and tall, their branches intertwining in a dense canopy above. The air here was heavy with the scent of earth and moss, and the further they went in, the more disconnected they felt from the world they knew. It was like stepping into another reality. As they ventured deeper into the grove, something caught their eye, a faint trail of paw prints, barely visible against the dirt, leading further into the trees. The prints were fresh, and the hope that had been slowly fading reignited. But the closer they got to the end of the trail, the more strange things became. The trees around them began to shift in ways that didn't feel natural, and the sounds of the forest seemed to quiet down unnervingly. Even the birds stopped singing, as if the whole place was holding its breath. At the end of the trail, they found something unexpected. It wasn't the dog. No, the dog was nowhere to be seen. But what they did find was something that left them frozen, something that they could neither explain nor ignore. There, in the middle of the grove, was an old, forgotten house. It looked abandoned, weathered by years of neglect, but there was something about it that seemed to call them. The feeling of familiarity was unmistakable, like the house was tied to something deep inside them. They stood there, staring at it, unsure of what to make of it. Why had they come here? Why had the dog led them to this particular place? The tension in the air was palpable. They had followed the trail, chased after clues, but they had only come further into the unknown. The dog was still missing, but somehow it felt like they were getting closer to something much bigger than they had imagined. What was it about this place? Why had they been brought here? And what had the dog known that they didn't? As they approached the house, the weight of the moment pressed down on them. They knew they couldn't turn back now. But as they reached the front door, the mystery only deepened. The door creaked open on its own, as if inviting them in or warning them to stay out. What lay behind that door could change everything. Would they find their dog, or would this journey lead them to a discovery they weren't ready for? The uncertainty hung in the air, and the only thing they could do was take the next step forward. They stood frozen for a moment, the door creaking gently in the wind, as if inviting them into the unknown. The family exchanged uneasy glances, each of them feeling the weight of what lay ahead. The house, though old and decrepit, seemed oddly welcoming. It stood like a secret kept for years, hidden away in the midst of the grove, and they couldn't shake the feeling that it was tied to something bigger, something they didn't yet understand. The mother stepped forward first, her hand reaching out for the door, but her fingers hesitated just before making contact. Something about the silence in the air felt unnatural, as if they were being watched. The father, sensing her hesitation, moved alongside her. Together, they pushed the door open, the heavy wood groaning under the pressure. The interior was dimly lit by what little sunlight filtered through the grime-covered windows. Dust motes floated in the air, giving the room a ghostly feel. It was as if time had stopped inside the house, with everything left as it was years ago, frozen in place. As they entered, their footsteps echoed through the empty rooms. The house was vast, with long corridors and rooms filled with forgotten furniture and faded memories. There was no sign of the dog. No trace of any animal having been there at all. But there was something else, something unsettling. In every room they entered, the feeling of familiarity grew stronger, as if they had been there before, even though they knew they hadn't. It wasn't just the house that was familiar, it was the sense that it belonged to them, as if it were tied to their very past in a way that didn't make sense. The daughter, who had been quiet up until that point, was the first to break the silence. "This place, it feels strange, like we've been here before," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her words hit the air like a jolt of electricity. The others turned to her, each of them feeling the same odd sense of déjà vu. It was a feeling that no one could quite explain, but it was there lingering. They continued to explore the house, but no answers came. Each room was more confusing than the last. In one corner of the house, the father found a small, faded photograph tucked behind a cracked mirror. The image was old, worn by time, but there was something unmistakable about it. A family stood together, smiling for the camera, and yet, there was a haunting quality to their expressions. The photograph was of a family that looked so much like them, too much like them. The resemblance was striking, and it sent a chill down the father's spine. "Who were they?" the mother asked, looking over his shoulder. She, too, felt the strange connection. She couldn't place it, but she knew this wasn't just a coincidence. The mystery deepened when they ventured upstairs. The stairs creaked under their weight, and the air felt colder, almost as if the house itself was holding its breath. At the top of the stairs was a door locked, but old, as though it hadn't been opened in years. There was something about that door, something that made them feel both drawn to it and terrified of it at the same time. The daughter, feeling an unspoken pull, approached the door. Her hand hovered over the handle, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the house itself was waiting for her to open it. The others were hesitant, but they followed, unsure of what they were about to discover. When the door finally gave way, they were greeted by a small, dusty room. It was dimly lit by the same pale sunlight filtering through the grime-covered windows. But the room wasn't empty. In the center, sitting quietly in the corner, was a small, weathered box almost like a chest, old and worn with age. The box was plain, nothing extraordinary, but it seemed to hum with an energy that none of them could explain. The mother, drawn to it, knelt down beside it, her fingers brushing over the surface, feeling the grooves and indentations as though it had been waiting for her touch. As she opened the box, the room seemed to hold its breath. Inside, there was a collection of old trinkets, things that didn't seem to belong to any one person but had been gathered over time. Papers, photographs, and a few old letters. The letters were yellowed with age, the ink faded, but they were written in a language they couldn't understand. Something about them felt foreign, yet strangely familiar, like a memory they couldn't quite grasp. The mother's hands trembled as she sifted through them, the weight of the moment settling in. And then, buried at the bottom of the box, was something else, a small, tattered collar. The collar was unmistakable. It was their dog's collar, the one they had been searching for all this time. How could it be here, in this house, miles from where the dog had gone missing? The discovery sent shockwaves through the family. They stood in silence, each of them processing the impossible reality. How had the dog's collar ended up in this place? What did it mean? They had followed the trail, had searched for answers, but now they were more confused than ever. The house, the box, the collar, it all seemed to be part of something larger, something they couldn't yet understand. As the tension mounted, the father's voice broke the silence. "We need to find out who lived here. We need to know who these people were." His words were firm, but there was a layer of fear beneath them. Fear of what they might uncover. But just as they were about to leave the room, a soft sound echoed from somewhere downstairs. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a scratching noise, like claws on wood. The family froze. Was it their dog? Was it just the wind? Or was something else lurking in the shadows of the house, something they hadn't yet seen? The scratching grew louder, and the air thickened with a sense of dread. The family exchanged looks, their hearts racing, as they realized they weren't alone in the house. The mystery was deepening, and with every passing moment, the stakes were getting higher. What was waiting for them at the end of this journey? And could they handle what they were about to uncover? The scratching continued. Closer. And closer. And then, just as they were about to turn around, the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. The family was plunged into darkness, and they knew they had crossed a point of no return. Whatever this place held, it was not ready to let them go. The doors slammed shut with a deafening thud, cutting off their escape and leaving them in an eerie, suffocating silence. The family was frozen in place, hearts pounding in their chests. The scratching sound from downstairs had stopped, but now, the air itself seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy. The house, once abandoned and forgotten, now felt alive in a way none of them could explain. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the cracks in the walls, made their skin crawl. They were no longer just visitors in this house, they were intruders, trapped in a place that seemed to be hiding secrets, waiting for them to uncover them. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic beating of their hearts, the thudding in their ears as they tried to make sense of what had just happened. The mother reached out to the door, attempting to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door, like the house itself, had locked them in. Panic began to set in, but the father's voice broke through the tension. Stay calm. Let's find another way out. But as they tried to move toward the window, hoping to break it open, something caught their attention, the faintest movement at the top of the stairs. It was almost imperceptible, like the shadow of a figure shifting in the dim light. They all stopped, their eyes locking on the figure, their breath caught in their throats. The figure didn't move at first, but then, slowly, deliberately, it began to descend the stairs. The faint sound of footsteps, soft and measured, echoed through the house. The family's eyes widened, their collective breath held as the figure grew closer. It was a person, but there was something strange about the way they moved, slow, deliberate, as if they were in no hurry, as if they had all the time in the world. The figure's face was hidden in shadow, and the family could only make out the vague outline of a figure dressed in old, tattered clothing. The atmosphere in the room shifted, heavy with an unspoken tension. The family exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to speak, whether to run, or whether to stay frozen in place. But the figure wasn't alone. Behind it, another shadow emerged, smaller, low to the ground, moving with a quiet grace. The family's hearts leapt into their throats as the unmistakable outline of a dog came into view. It wasn't their dog, not the one they had been searching for, but it was a dog. A large, dark creature, its fur matted and wild, its eyes glinting in the dim light as it moved toward them. The creature's presence felt wrong, unnatural. It wasn't just an animal, it was something else, something more. The family stepped back instinctively, their bodies tensing with fear. The dog didn't growl or bark, it just watched them, its eyes fixed on them with a strange, unsettling intensity. It seemed to be waiting, as though it had a purpose, its movements deliberate, not of a stray, but of something with direction. The figure in front of them spoke for the first time, its voice low and gravelly, like it had not been used in years. "You've come looking for answers," it said, its tone heavy with a strange wisdom. "But some things should remain hidden." The family's breath caught in their throats. The figure's words seemed to weigh down the air between them, and they found themselves unable to speak. Who was this person? What did they know? And what did they mean by some things should remain hidden? Before they could ask another question, the figure stepped aside, revealing something that made the blood run cold in their veins. Behind the shadowy figure, hidden in the shadows of the room, was another door, one that they hadn't seen before. It wasn't like the others, cracked and old. This one was pristine, new, as if it had been waiting for them. It beckoned, its polished surface gleaming in the dim light, untouched by time. But there was something wrong about it, a wrongness that was hard to explain, like the house itself was pulling them toward it, urging them to open it, to find whatever lay beyond. The family stood paralyzed, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. The air was thick with tension, and yet there was no way to turn back now. Whatever lay behind that door was the final piece of the puzzle, the last thread they had to pull on to understand why they were here. But at the same time, opening that door felt like it would unlock something too dangerous to face. The dog's eyes glinted in the shadows, its gaze never leaving them, watching, waiting. The figure smiled, but it was not a smile that offered comfort. It was a smile full of secrets, full of knowing. The answers you seek are beyond this door, the figure said. But beware, sometimes the truth is more than we can bear. The family exchanged looks, each one unsure of what to do. Was this the moment they had been waiting for, the moment that would reveal everything? Or was it a trap, one last test they weren't ready for? They had come so far, followed so many clues, and yet, with every step, the path only grew more confusing, more dangerous. The dog, the mysterious figure, the strange house, it was all tied together. But how? There was no more time to think. The silence was broken by the faintest rustling of the dog's fur as it shifted, its eyes flickering toward the door. And then, as if the house itself had made up its mind, the door creaked open, just a crack. The smell of old wood and earth seeped through, and with it, a rush of cold air that made them all shiver. The door was waiting for them to cross the threshold. The mother stepped forward, her hand trembling, drawn to the door, her instincts screaming at her to stop. But she couldn't. She had to know. They all had to know. With a single step, she crossed the threshold. And as she did, the world shifted. As the mother crossed the threshold, the moment she stepped inside felt like everything around her shifted. The air thickened, and the light from the other room flickered, casting shadows that twisted unnaturally along the walls. The strange, unsettling silence that had dominated the house was suddenly pierced by a low hum of vibration in the floor, in the walls, in the very air they breathed. The hairs on her neck stood on end, and for the first time, she felt as though she wasn't just stepping into a room, but into something far deeper, something ancient. The others hesitated, standing at the doorway, unwilling to follow just yet. The door behind them slammed shut with a force that made them jump. The air was thick with tension, and the only sound was the echo of the mother's breath, now quickening as she stood in the middle of the room. It was empty, at least, it appeared so at first glance. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw something she hadn't expected. There, in the far corner of the room, was a mirror, large, ornate, and framed with intricate designs that seemed too old to be from any time they knew. The mirror wasn't just reflecting the room, it was reflecting something else. Something wrong. At first, she couldn't make sense of it. The reflection wasn't quite right. It flickered like a broken television screen, shifting between different moments in time, showing flashes of the house in states of decay, but also, strangely, in moments when it seemed alive and full of light. But what caught her breath in her throat was the image of the dog, her dog, its eyes locked onto hers in the reflection. It wasn't the dog she remembered. Its fur was darker, its eyes almost human, and it was growling. No, not just growling. It was snarling, but its lips didn't move. The sound came from within her own head, filling her mind with a terrible, bone-deep dread. The mirror flickered again, and the dog's reflection disappeared, replaced by another image. The family, her family, but not the way they were now. They were younger, dressed in clothes from another time, standing together in front of the same house, smiling in a way that felt too happy, too perfect. But there was something in their eyes, a glimmer of recognition that no one could ignore. They were standing there like they had been waiting for this exact moment. The mother's heart pounded as she stepped back, her mind racing. What was this place? How could they have known this house, this moment? How was this even possible? She reached out to touch the mirror, almost compelled by an unseen force, but just as her fingers brushed the surface, a violent jolt ran through her body. A sharp, unbearable pain shot up her arm, as if something was trying to pull her into the reflection. She recoiled, gasping for breath, her heart racing in panic. The others rushed forward at the sound of her gasp, but the moment they entered the room, the door slammed shut once more, trapping them inside. The air turned frigid, the temperature dropping rapidly, and with it, the hum grew louder, as if something powerful, something ancient, was awakening. The shadows in the room seemed to twist, and the family could hear a low whisper, a faint, guttural voice that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The father moved toward the mirror, drawn by the same magnetic pull that had taken the mother moments before. His hand trembled as he reached out, but just as he was about to touch it, the ground beneath their feet shuddered violently. It was as if the house itself had come alive, as if it were aware of their presence, watching them, waiting for them to make the next move. The dog, the strange, dark creature from the corner of the room, stepped forward, its eyes locked onto the family. The air around it seemed to warp, distorting like a heatwave rising from the ground. It was as though the dog wasn't just an animal, it was the gatekeeper, the one who controlled what lay beyond the mirror, the one who held the answers. Its eyes glowed, and for a moment, it wasn't a dog at all, it was something else, something more terrifying. In that moment, the house seemed to breathe, the walls groaning as if they were alive, and the mirror shifted again. The family's reflections in it no longer matched their movements. They were standing still, trapped in time, their reflections moving as if they were not in the room at all, but somewhere far away, perhaps in another time, or even another reality. The reflection of the dog was there too. But it wasn't the same creature anymore. It was larger, more menacing, and it was moving toward them, walking out of the mirror as if it had always been there, waiting. The family screamed in unison, but the sound was swallowed by the overwhelming hum that filled the room. The reflection in the mirror continued to shift, showing them moments they hadn't lived, moments they couldn't understand. It was as if the house was rewriting their history, pulling them deeper into its grasp. They were no longer in control. As the dog's reflection stepped out of the mirror, its form solidifying before their eyes, the room seemed to collapse around them. The walls began to close in, the space shrinking, the light dimming. The family's eyes darted frantically from one another to the mirror, the dog, the shifting shadows. Panic set in as they realized they were being pulled into something far greater than they could comprehend. This wasn't just about a lost pet anymore. It wasn't even about the house. It was about them, their past, and something ancient that had been waiting for them, just beyond the veil of reality. The mother reached out to grab the others, pulling them toward the door, but the space between them and freedom seemed to stretch impossibly far. The house, alive with energy, was now closing in on them, and the dog's reflection in the mirror had turned to face them fully. Its glowing eyes were the last thing they saw before everything went black. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the house fell silent once more. The family stood at the edge of the unknown, trapped in a place where time and reality no longer made sense. What they would find next, they couldn't begin to imagine, but they had no choice but to keep moving forward. The path ahead was dark, and the answers they sought might be far worse than anything they could have ever prepared for. The silence was overwhelming. The shadows in the room seemed to press in from all sides, and for a moment, it felt like the family had been swallowed whole by the house. No more hum, no more whispers. Just a heavy, suffocating stillness that left them gasping for breath. It felt as though time itself had stopped, as if they had been trapped in an eternal moment. But even in the silence, something was stirring. A low growl, distant but unmistakable, reverberated through the floor beneath their feet. The dog knew that creature was still there. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. The monstrous, shadowy form had fully emerged from the mirror, its eyes now fixed on the family with an unnerving sense of purpose. They could feel it. This wasn't just a chase for a lost dog anymore, it was something deeper, something sinister. The dog wasn't a pet. It wasn't even just a guardian. It was a force of the house, an entity that had been waiting for them to unlock the mystery buried within these walls. The family realized with a jolt that it wasn't the dog that had been lost, it was them. They were the ones who had been drawn here. The mother backed away instinctively, but her feet wouldn't move fast enough. The creature lunged, and the air seemed to crackle with electricity as the family braced for the worst. But just before it reached them, the father stepped forward, his voice shaking but resolute. "We're not afraid of you," he said, his words barely above a whisper, but somehow they felt like a challenge. And then, to their shock, the dog halted. The creature's glowing eyes flickered for just a second before it let out a low, mournful howl, a sound that echoed through the room, like a cry from the past. The family watched in disbelief as the dog lowered its head, as though it was bowing to something they couldn't see. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. The mother stepped forward, her pulse racing, but something in the air had shifted. The oppressive weight of the house, the fear that had gripped them, seemed to dissolve, replaced by an odd sense of clarity. The mirror, which had once reflected shifting images of a past they didn't understand, now seemed to show something else. The family, standing together in front of the mirror, saw their own reflections, but not as they were now. No, they saw themselves as children, as they had once been, standing in the yard of a house that looked strikingly familiar. The dog, not as the monstrous creature it had been, but as the loyal companion it had always been, was standing beside them. They were home. The realization hit them like a wave. This was their house, this had always been their house, long before they had ever known it. The house wasn't just a place. It was their place, a home that had once been lost to time, to memory, to history. The dog, their dog, had been there too. Somehow, impossibly, they had returned. They had come full circle. But the twist, the truth that hit them with force was something they had never expected. The house wasn't just a building. It was part of them. The memories, the images they had seen in the mirror, were their own memories, their own lives they had lived before. The family wasn't just a victim of circumstance. They had been drawn back, not by the house, but by themselves. They had been searching for something they had lost, but it wasn't just a dog. They had been searching for their own past, for a part of themselves they had forgotten. And now, the house had found them again. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The reason the dog had led them here, the reason they had been so drawn to this place, wasn't just chance. It wasn't a coincidence that they had followed the dog, or that they had found the house. They had always been meant to come back. They had been called. And now, standing in the center of the house, they understood. They weren't trapped. They had never been trapped. They had been found. As the family stood together, the dog's eyes softened, its form beginning to shift back into something more familiar, more comforting. The creature was no longer a force of fear, it was the guide, the protector. And in the moment of clarity, the family realized that they had never truly lost what they had been searching for. The house, the dog, their memories, it was all part of them, waiting to be rediscovered. But just as they were about to breathe a sigh of relief, the room around them began to change once more. The walls groaned again, the house shifting as if reacting to their understanding. The light flickered again, this time revealing something in the corner of the room, another door, smaller this time, hidden in the shadows. It hadn't been there before. The air grew heavy once more, thick with tension. And as they looked toward the door, the dog growled softly, a warning. It wasn't over. Not yet. The journey they had embarked on was just beginning. And as they took a step toward the new door, they realized that the house wasn't done with them. It had led them here for a reason, and the answers they had found only scratched the surface. There was still more to uncover, more to understand. The house was waiting, and it always had been. In that moment, the family knew that their journey wasn't just about finding their way home. It was about something much bigger. And the real story was only just beginning. The family stood frozen for a moment, staring at the door that had appeared out of nowhere. The shadows in the room seemed to pull toward it, as if something beyond that door had been calling them all along. The dog, still standing by their side, gave a low growl, a soft warning, but the family could no longer ignore the pull. There was no turning back now. They had come this far, faced the mysteries, the fear, the inexplicable forces that had brought them here, and now they were ready to confront whatever came next. With a deep breath, the father stepped forward, his hand reaching for the handle. The moment his fingers touched it, the door creaked open, revealing a dim hallway beyond. It was narrow, the walls lined with faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges. The air smelled old, musty, as if this part of the house hadn't been disturbed in years. Or maybe decades. There was something ancient about this space, something that felt like it had been waiting for them to find it. They stepped into a hallway together, the floorboards creaking under their weight. The dog followed, its eyes constantly scanning, alert as if sensing something they couldn't yet see. The hallway stretched out before them, winding through the house like a labyrinth. Each turn they made only seemed to lead deeper into the unknown. It was as if the house was alive, responding to their every movement, guiding them further into its depths. The family couldn't help but feel like they were being led down a path they had no choice but to follow, as if the house itself had chosen them for a purpose. As they moved deeper, the atmosphere became heavier. The air grew colder, and the sense of unease that had been with them since they first arrived returned, but now it was tinged with a sense of anticipation. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the light made them tense, but they kept moving forward. There was no other choice. Eventually, they reached the end of the hallway, where another door stood. This one was old, weathered, its surface cracked and worn by years of neglect. The door seemed to beckon them, calling them to open it. And so, with a shared glance, they did. Inside, the room was dark, save for a single beam of light that filtered through a crack in the wall, illuminating a dusty, long-forgotten table in the center of the room. On the table lay an old, leather-bound book. The air felt thick with history, the room heavy with secrets that had been locked away for years. The family exchanged uncertain looks, but the mother was the first to approach the table. She reached for the book, her fingers brushing the worn cover. It was surprisingly warm to the touch, as if it had been waiting for her. When she opened it, the pages inside were yellowed with age, but they were still legible. As she began to read, the words seemed to leap off the page, filling her with a deep sense of recognition. The story it told wasn't just any story. It was their story. The book detailed the history of the house, its origins, its purpose, and the mysterious bond it had with the family. It was more than just a home. It was a place that had been built on a foundation of memories and forgotten lives. The family's connection to it was not a coincidence. They had been drawn here for a reason. This house, this land, had been part of their history long before they had ever stepped foot inside. The book spoke of cycles of families who had come and gone, of lives that had been intertwined with the house's fate. And now, it seemed, it was their turn to complete the cycle. As the mother continued to read, the pieces of their journey began to fall into place. The house had been built by their ancestors, generations ago, as a sanctuary of sorts, a place that held not just memories, but power. It was a place of transition, a place where time didn't work in a linear fashion. It was a space that bent and twisted, waiting for the right moment to reveal its true nature. The family hadn't just stumbled upon it, they had been led here by the dog, the mysterious guide that had brought them back to where they belong. The more she read, the more the mother understood. This house wasn't just a place of mystery, it was a living entity, and it had chosen them to help it fulfill its purpose. The dog, the strange creature they had followed all this way, was not just a lost animal. It was a guardian, a protector, one that had been bound to the house for as long as it had stood. And now, with their arrival, the house was awakening again, ready to begin a new chapter. As the realization dawned on them, the family felt a strange sense of peace wash over them. The confusion, the fear, the chaos of the past few days, all of it seemed to dissipate in an instant. They weren't lost anymore. They had found what they were meant to find. And the house, the dog, the strange journey they had taken, they were all part of something bigger, something that had always been waiting for them. But even as the family stood in the room, the book in their hands, another twist emerged. The door to the room slammed shut behind them, and the house seemed to shudder once more. The dog, which had been calmly sitting at their feet, suddenly began to growl, its fur standing on end. It wasn't the same creature they had seen before. This was the guardian, the protector, but something had changed. It was no longer just a guide, it was now an adversary. The air grew thick with tension as the family realized they had one final choice to make. The house had chosen them, but now they had to decide whether they were willing to embrace their place in its story. The dog's growl deepened, echoing through the room like a warning. The family was no longer passive players in this mystery, they were now part of the cycle. The question was, would they accept it, or would they try to run, to leave this place behind once more? As they stood in that room, the weight of the decision pressed on them. The dog moved forward, its eyes narrowing. But then, in a sudden, shocking moment, the creature stopped. Its gaze softened, and it looked at them with a sense of knowing, as if it was waiting for them to make the final move. In that instant, the house seemed to exhale, as if the decision had been made. The room brightened, and the door behind them creaked open once again. This time, it wasn't the same oppressive darkness. Instead, the light from the hallway shone through, welcoming them. The family understood that they had been tested, and they had passed. The house, with all its mysteries and its power, had chosen them to continue the cycle. They walked out of the room together, the dog following them, and as they stepped into the hallway, they realized that they had found something far more valuable than a lost pet or an old house. They had found a deeper connection to their past, to the land, and to each other. They had discovered that some homes are more than just buildings, they are places of meaning, places that hold memories, that hold power, and that sometimes, we must return to them in order to truly understand who we are. As they left the house behind, the final mystery was revealed. The journey they had undertaken was not just about finding a lost dog, it was about finding themselves, rediscovering a past they had forgotten, and embracing the unknown. And with that, they knew they were ready to face whatever came next, together. The house had led them home, but the true adventure was just beginning.